in their home, which in many respects made it easier, and it also it facilitated slaves having some hope, though minor, though small, of becoming free in one's lifetime. So in the South, it went from chattel slavery to serfdom. And the difference between chattel slavery and serfdom is that as a serf, you're not a commodity in the way that you are as chattel. It's literally, chattel means property. And serfdom in the South meant that you were no longer property, but Southerners were rigorous at preventing any mobility. And in fact, in the wake of the Civil War, every county in every state had laws prohibiting blacks from leaving their county. And if they did, it was a prison term. In the North, it went from an artisanal society, which we've talked about a lot, to very quickly during the war an industrial society. And it starts very early in the war. And in fact, so at the beginning of the war, in terms of the North trying to disseminate outfits, shoes, and guns to Northern volunteers. I mean, the shoes, in the 1861, 1862, Northerners in the war, in their shoes, they created shoes that were exactly the same, and you wore into your left foot and your right foot. It wasn't until like 1864 that they created left foot shoes and right foot shoes. Same with uniforms. So it was during the war that industrialization really picks up dramatically. And in the South, I'll begin with the South. This is a photograph of sharecroppers in Mississippi. So they were tied to the land. They were not chattel slaveries, but they were unfree. Black families rented plots of land to harvest crops. The landowner, which is often the former planter, provided housing, tools, seed, often a mule, food, supplies, all on credit. And at harvest time, sharecroppers received a share of the crop, which is a third to a half. And the landowner, typically a former slave owner, took the rest. The sharecropper used his share of the crop to pay down his debt. Often the debt increased. That was essentially how the South evolved from chattel slavery to sharecropping and essentially another form of slavery in which one was tied to the land. Compared to chattel slavery, there was some degree of independence. There are no more overseers or legal owners, but blacks suffered from the debt peonage. So they cultivated a plot of land. They were tied to it, as I mentioned, and they were legally prohibited from moving to another county or state. And as I mentioned, if they did and they were captured, it was a prison term. Sharecropping remained common through the Depression until World War II, really. And in fact, here is a photograph of Dorothea Lange, who was a photographer and an activist, and she photographed sharecroppers in Alabama in the 1930s. Another photograph is from Dorothea Lange, 13-year-old sharecropper near Americus, Georgia, in 1937. The second form of unfreedom was the rise of mass incarceration and convict leasing. Sharecropping and convict leasing replaced chattel slavery as another form of unfreedom in the South. There was no freedom of mobility. and one was tied to the land. So let me just elaborate on what convict leasing is. Sharecroppers became convicts through debt vagrancy. They were in debt, they were accused of vagrancy, they were imprisoned, and under vagrancy laws, unemployed blacks could be incarcerated unless you could announce your profession or who you're working for. You could be incarcerated. Convicts could then be leased out and worked to death, and that was not uncommon. Vagrancy laws were also known as black codes. African Americans could be arrested and imprisoned for being accused of stealing $1. And that was whether or not you were 10 years old or 50 years old. They were then leased out to build railroads, to do hard manual labor, the kind of labor that would kill you in the heat within a year. Blacks could be arrested and imprisoned for being accused of, as I mentioned, stealing $1. They could also be leased out by owners who controlled them as sharecroppers. Convict leasing began in Mississippi even before the end of Reconstruction in 1868. That year, Edmund Richardson, a wealthy planter before the war, struck a bargain with authorities in Mississippi. And here is Colonel Edward Richardson. He was a colonel in the rebellion. Richardson needed cheap labor to work land in the Yazoo Delta of Mississippi. The state prison was overflowing with former slaves. The result was that Richardson worked felons on his Delta farms, promised to feed, clothe, and guard them. And the Mississippi state authorities agreed to pay him $18,000 a year for overseeing these former slaves, and that was a lot of money at the time. Richardson kept all the profits. And convict leasing legally took off in 1876, which is the formal end of Reconstruction, following a newly white legislature that passed a crime bill aimed at blacks. The new law defined grand larceny as theft of any property, i.e. money, clothes, or land worth $10 or more that the debtor was unable to pay. The law led to 18-year-old African American children being sent to prison for stealing change, literally for being accused of stealing a dime or a nickel. The legislature had exclusive rights to lease state convicts, and it was one of the most prized political contracts. So to lease convicts, you lease them out to an industrialist who worked them virtually to death. They had, again, in a sense, it's slavery because they have no freedom of mobility and no legal rights in the way that whites had. Richardson established guidelines that other white Southerners would follow. He brought only able-bodied blacks, mostly men, to his Delta farms to work the farms. His successors subleased convicts to railroads and other companies, as I mentioned. The lessor or sublessor and the state all made money from this system, which brutally worked convicts. Mississippi officially ended convict leasing in 1890, not on humanitarian grounds, but on the grounds that it enriched the wealthy planter at expense of the state government and white society, which wanted the money for hospital expenses, paved roads, public schools, etc. Richardson's land became the Parchman Farm, which generated a huge amount of wealth for the state. The Parchman Farm became essentially a large prison. Governor James Vardaman, known as the White Chief, was the brainchild behind the Parchman Farm. Here's a photograph of James Vardaman, who is, he looks to me like a classic Southern wealthy Southerner. And he was, Vardaman often declared, quote, "The only effect of Negro education is to spoil a good field hand and make an insolent cook." He was truly worthless. The analogy that I've used before is it was not dissimilar to the ways that Jews were treated in Germany before and during World War II. The Parchman Farm, this is a photograph of workers doing field work on Parchman in the Parchman prison. And they had to, the day began at 4:30 in the morning, and blacks started working at dawn. There were what's known as dog boys at the Parchman Farm in Mississippi. And they were bloodhounds that were bred and trained by young boys to recapture runaways. And the recapture rate was almost 100% because of that. Dog boys were privileged prisoners, so they were both prisoners, but they received more food and a little better facilities for sleeping. And it functioned as a form of divide and conquer. Parchman provided incentives for recapture. If an armed convict tried to escape and a dog boy was wounded, he was pardoned and liberated from Parchman. This is the superintendent's house of Parchman Prison, which is a model, and in fact it had been one of a large plantation house before the war. So you see the similarities between large plantations in which there were 50 or 100 or more enslaved people. And this is the main house, and the house remains intact for, in a sense, similar purposes. The superintendent ran the Parchman Farm like slave masters in the antebellum period. He lived in this mansion that I'm showing you. He was appointed by the governor of the state, and in each southern state, especially in the Deep South, there was a home like this. Convict servants attended to his needs. The state wanted an experienced farmer to generate profits, not to rehabilitate convicts. The Parchman evolved into Angola Prison in Louisiana, which is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. And this I won't show you, but there was a journalist who did a 30-minute film on the Angola prison today. If any of you want to, I'm happy to send it to any of you who would be interested in seeing it. But there are a number of clips here where you gain a sense of what it's like being in Angola prison in Louisiana today. And most of what they did was work that essentially generates money for the state. So let me just move on and ask, why did Northerners do nothing to prevent the new order of black unfreedom in the South? Why did they do nothing? And the short answer is the North had its own problems. The massive and truly massive, almost unprecedented industrialization over the 4 years of Civil War replaces the artisanal free labor ideal, especially in terms of railroads, steel and coal companies, and these early industries and large companies. There was no protection for workers, no minimum wage law, and no labor laws. Eric Foner, many of you probably know who he is. He has a wonderful summary of the Civil War and says that the tragic irony of the war is that each side fought to defend a distinct vision of the good society that each side represented. But each vision was destroyed by the very struggle to preserve it. Artisanal society was destroyed and it quickly became industrial. Chattel slavery and the money that was made in chattel slavery was destroyed. Wealthy Southerners still made money, but it wasn't nearly as much in the South as it had been in the antebellum period. In fact, Southerners controlled most of the wealth. The vast majority of wealth was in the South. In fact, I mentioned to Roberto that have any of you been to Natchez, Mississippi? So Natchez, Mississippi is one of the most beautiful cities in the country. It's on the Mississippi River. And it was created by white Southerners during the antebellum period as a retreat when it was really hot. And so it's right on the river. But the buildings they spared no expense in creating the buildings and the artwork. And enslaved people were there, but it was the retreat for these masters. And as I mentioned, for the wealthiest plantations, the owner of the plantation was usually an absentee owner, and he would hire chief operating officers, is what we would call them today, to oversee the work on the plantation. And so Frederick Douglass, most of you have probably read Frederick Douglass, one of his 3 autobiographies. He was born in the Tuckahoe Plantation. Edward Lloyd was the owner. He owned 5 plantations. Douglass never met him. He never knew him because his legal owner, he spent most of his time in Washington, D.C. And there was a chief operating officer on the plantation, which is who Douglass knew. So the massive industrialization, this is a summary in the North. From 1873 to 1897, 16 years were Depression years. The Panic and Depression, which was sparked by the industrialist Jay Cooke and Company, lasted from for a panic and depression. This is a comparatively long period of time, and it was a result of overproduction from corporations and industry. Northerners create major industrial buildings and corporations to do wage work, and essentially they overproduced. They overproduced and prices fell because there wasn't the demand that they had anticipated, which led to depression years, deep depression years between 1882 and 1886, and then again from 1893 to 1897. And it was also a period of massive migration. In fact, the largest in terms of numbers, massive migration from Europe especially to the United States between 1870s and 1890s. In fact, more people migrated between 1870 and 1900 than the entire US population in 1860. That's how dramatic it was. I'll just repeat that. More people migrated to the United States between 1870 and 1900 than in the US population in 1860. It was immense, and there was no protection for workers. That was a long time before worker compensation and protection. And that led to profound discontent and unrest. The 14th Amendment, which was passed during the war, ended up protecting corporations, not freed people or industrial workers. And the best example that I'll use is, and for the law school students, some of you probably have encountered this fascinating legal case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad in 1886. Santa Clara County had been taxing the land and the rights of way of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Southern Pacific Railroad refused to pay taxes to the county for 6 years. The railroad had property with a $30 million mortgage, and it refused to pay taxes of a small amount, which is $30,000. In the sense, it would be like having a $10,000 car and refusing to pay a $10 tax on it. And the whole function was for Santa Clara County to bring it up to a court case. And in fact, it took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. The railroad did so in the hopes of obtaining protections from the 14th Amendment. And the Southern Pacific Railroad lawyers argued, and this happens in the 19th century, Southern Pacific Railroad lawyers argue that corporations are persons entitled to equal protection under the law of the 14th Amendment. And that continues to manifest itself today. And in fact, the lawyers say, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. That's from the 14th Amendment. And the Southern Pacific Railroad, as I said, wins the case, and it establishes a precedent for corporations enjoying constitutional protections created by the nation's founders and radical Republicans during Reconstruction, which guaranteed to all citizens, especially freed people, free speech and other civil liberties. So a question for you is, here's a photograph of the Southern Pacific Railroad, or the train, in 1886. How many people are there in this photo? Remember, you have to include the train. The train is legally a person. The upshot of corporations being defined as persons coupled with widespread depression is that this began the era in which corporations had far greater control than individual workers. Workers were prohibited from collective bargaining until 1935, which we'll get into the next couple of weeks, with the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act. Workers had little opportunity for advancement. Corporations produced more than Americans could consume. Corporate leaders argued that they could not afford to produce less owing to the capital costs. The results were the corporations acquired new global markets. As I mentioned, the rise of corporations in the North led to an overproduction. And so they were threatened with bankruptcy because they overproduced and they didn't have buyers for their goods, which led them to become imperial, led them to acquire new areas. So one example is the Mexican railroads. The entirety of Mexico's railroads were created and made by industrialists in the United States. It was a period in which the United States acquires Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal Zone. All because there's essentially overproducing and they need new territory to satisfy the demand. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about kind of the different class structures that kind of emerge from this, as in the corporation being put as its own person
Yes.
versus like the owner of the corporation, and how that kind of separated the
Yeah, so I mean, it's not dissimilar from today. In a corporation, the CEO and the elite are paid, what, 5 times, 10 times as much money as as most workers and most other employees of that corporation. There's a rigid hierarchy that's defined primarily in terms of money. And that it begins in this period, in this the postbellum period. It begins in a profound and it's truly revolutionary how quickly Northerners created large corporations. It's stunning. The corporations that were created between 1865 and 1880 surpassed that. I mean, most of Europe I've mentioned had already industrialized, but it took them a long time to industrialize. Partly, and that's part of the reason why the U.S. was able to industrialize so much more quickly, because they borrowed from what Europe had done.
And then what were like the kind of demographics of the people who were able to capitalize on that within the North? Was it people who had established familiar backgrounds, like wealth generated?
That's a great question. So in the Midwestern states, so the artisanal economy still didn't disappear. In the Midwestern states, Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas, large parts of Kansas and Missouri, they were still independent artisans, entrepreneurs. They're basically families. And I mean, I should say I grew up in Iowa, and there's still a large part of the state in which their families there have been there for 100 years, over 100 years. And they're struggling now in profound ways. So that's one part in which there is still an artisanal economy in the states that had not industrialized, where there weren't huge cities in the United States. So the East Coast was profoundly industrial, and especially places like New York and Boston. If you were a poor person, white or black, in Boston or New York, your life was miserable. The exploitation of work was extraordinary. Same with Philadelphia. Same with the large northern cities. And the difference is the small towns in the Midwest, in the middle of the country, without major cities. And it's really the major cities where the industrialists wanted to create their plants and recruit people from elsewhere. And a number of farmers thought that they would, in theory, receive more wages, but they didn't. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. So imperialism is in service to corporate profits. You acquire new territory in order to make the kind of money that, in order to accommodate the overproduction of goods. Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad.
Professor,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, this is probably such a silly question, but how is acquiring more land going to help with the overproduction? Because if you're buying the land to like produce more, how is that?
So the industrialists who bought land bought it to create railroads and essentially corporations. In the Midwest, there wasn't that much buying of new land. So in the states that were not, where the population was comparatively small, that was still where artisanal work was common. In the cities, and that's where the cities were expanded greatly. The origin of the suburb is created in the postbellum period, in a sense. And that's where corporations wanted to have their home because of the number of workers available that they could essentially hire and exploit. And it was not at all artisanal. It was truly industrial.
So you're buying land, it's like you have this overproduction as an
Yes.
industrialist.
Yes.
And you have to like buy more land
Yes.
to like build a railroad.
Yes.
To balance out, and then you'll have profit from that.
That's right. That's right. And that's why they acquired all these new territories. They were overproducing, and the new territories allowed them to remain afloat in many respects and increase their profits and revenues. And it was solely economic for these purchases. Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you. I should have clarified that. Yeah, which is why U.S. acquires Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, and Panama Canal Zone. And so, yeah, as I said, imperialism is in service to these corporations. Corporations they overproduce, so they need more space. They need more land to create buildings and work. Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, many of you are familiar probably with it. It was updated in 2010, so it's still in existence. And it's in the Supreme Court case Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. Reversed a century-old finance restriction that enabled corporations and other big money groups to spend unlimited funds on elections. So corporations today are understood by the federal government to be people, enjoying the same freedoms of speech as individuals, and are allowed to spend massive sums on elections. And that is comparatively new. That wasn't the case 60 years ago. This Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific, the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission was a brutal negative, had a brutal negative effect. This is a political cartoon by Ralph Yardley, who was a well-known cartoonist, a political cartoonist in the turn of the 20th century, where he has Uncle Sam looking over Pearl Harbor, in which Uncle Sam is saying this property is not for sale. I mean, they acquired Pearl Harbor, for industrial purposes. Hold on a second. Yeah, this is another political cartoon from Louis Dalrymple, in which it's a profoundly racist cartoon. It was also during this period in which massive amounts of immigrants come from all over, as I mentioned, and most of them were what we would call now non-whites. And this is a schoolroom in which, let's see, hold on, let me get my notes and I can, because you won't be able to read that. Hold on. Yeah, so it reflects William McKinley oversaw much of the Gilded Age imperialism. And many of you probably know that Trump's favorite president is William McKinley, partly for his ambition to acquire new territories. In 1898, McKinley declared war against Spain over Cuban independence. After the U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, McKinley honed in on Pearl Harbor, which he saw as a natural coaling station for ships to fuel up on coal. McKinley then annexed the Hawaiian Islands through an illegal joint resolution of House and Senate instead of the legal method of the House voting and passing a bill followed by the Senate vote. And this was despite vigorous protests from Queen Liliuokalani, who is the queen in Hawaii. A republic, Hawaii was a republic in 1894, and it became a U.S. territory in 1900, and as you know, in 1959, a U.S. state. Again, as a way to satisfy and bolster corporate profits. Both territorial and statehood acts violated the 1899 international laws of occupation established by the Hague Convention that the U.S. had ratified. Ralph Yardley, and that's why I'm showing this, was a well-known American cartoonist. And I'm familiar with Yardley. He exposed the outrageousness of a lot of these corporations and corporate bosses. He opposed annexing Hawaii. He opposed imperialism. McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz, a radical anarchist. And Yardley casts Uncle Sam as ugly, arrogant, and deceitful. He's there at the desk. Actually, here's Uncle Sam from Yardley, Uncle Sam looks pathetic. And he does another cartoon, political cartoon, essentially, of school beginning, in which Uncle Sam disciplines his young colonialists, and their students, young children from the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, all of which the United States had control over to a certain degree. The plaque above the window reads, "The Confederate States refused their consent to be governed, but the Union was preserved without their consent," i.e. colonials, according, and Dalrymple is exploiting this, and in my view, it's a critique of industrialization. Colonials will be taught with or without their consent. Uncle Sam is at the desk, and at the desk with Uncle Sam, you can't read it, but it says U.S. First Lessons in Self-Government. The sheet underneath reads, "The New Class, Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico." At the window, at the door, you see this open window, is a racist rendering of a black man washing the window. He's actually above, not the open door, but the one right behind the teacher. Next to the open window door is a racist caricature of indigenous students reading, an indigenous student reading a primer upside down. There's a racist caricature of a Chinese boy outside by the window, apparently hoping to get in. And it's a U.S. white children, diligent and well-dressed, reading books about various U.S. states, comparatively recent annexations, Alaska, Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. And then on the blackboard, let me just read it to you. The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies, whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization, i.e., for these industrialists in the United States, England is a model of imperialism. The United States must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they govern themselves. And in fact, today, as you all know, the United States holds 5 overseas colonies: Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. That's a continuation of this, essentially the response of industrialization. And as all of you know, Trump wants to colonize Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, especially Greenland right now. But that's the background. There's a long tradition. Trump is following in the footsteps of McKinley and of other presidents. the upshot is the Republican Party's free labor ideal of a nation of independent artisans, entrepreneurs is totally, absolutely destroyed, except for the few small towns. I mean, there's still artisanal work in small communities and towns where people can do it. But the percentage in terms of the United States is tiny. It's based on, I mean, it's hard to come up with an accurate statistic, but from some of the statistics I've read, it's between 1% and 5% at most. The Republican Party's free labor ideal is, in a sense, destroyed, and it's replaced by exploitative industrialization and imperialism. And the Republican Party was the progressive party through the war. It was the central platform of the Republican Party when it was founded was that slavery was wrong. Slavery was wrong and evil and inhumane. And the central platform is that slavery should be abolished, gradually be abolished. And a number of radicals, radical abolitionists, were part of the Republican Party that led Lincoln to be elected. And this is a summary. The Republican Party's free labor ideal of a nation of independent artisans is destroyed. And so here's an example of two different voices. Lincoln in 1861 summarizes the vision of labor in the North. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Meaning the artisanal idea, laborers working on farms, the artisanship is foundational to any other, to capital. It's foundational to capital. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. And Lincoln never defined himself until 1864 during the Civil War. He never defined himself as a revolutionary. And in 64, after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he reluctantly defined himself as a revolutionary. But he was, as an anti-slavery activist, he believed in this ideal of anyone being able to receive, men and women. In fact, in one speech, he says, "I believe that every black woman has the same right to receive the fruit of her own labor as any white man." So Lincoln summarizes this artisanal ideal in 1861, and by 1880, capital is superior to labor, and it's part of the industrial capitalist ethos. And this is summarized by Rutherford B. Hayes. This government of the people, by the people, and for the people this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, no longer. It is a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. I'm quoting him. And he sees that as a positive. He sees that as a positive for the economic and cultural growth of the United States. So it highlights the radical shift, a fairly quick shift of the Republican Party from artisans to financiers and captains of industry. Republican Party is now the organ, as I say, of financiers, industrialists, who champion wage labor that benefits the corporation. And the demand for wage labor was also accommodated by an unprecedented number of immigrants. So more people, and part of it is just wars in Europe and a number of reasons, but more people migrate to the United States between 1876 and 1900 than the entire U.S. population in 1860. That's an extraordinary statistic. More people came between 76 and 1900, 25 years, than the entire population of 1860. And from 1879 to 1885, there were over 3,000 strikes, strikers in industry, involving over 700,000 workers. There were no protections for laborers at all. Strikes were seen as a form of insurrection. Business leaders, in fact, referred to strikes as insurrections. They didn't call it a strike then, they called it an insurrection. And they called in federal troops or private militias to suppress them. And so there's essentially in the post-Civil War era in the North, there is massive warfare between capital and labor. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this radical economist, activist, environmentalist, Scott Nearing, some of you may have read some of his work, said the advocate of a labor union is as unpopular in the capitalist society, i.e. USA, as the abolitionist was in the Carolinas before Civil War. And frankly, if you were an abolitionist in South or North Carolina from 1850 to 1860, there was a good chance you would be lynched. Advocating unions or racial equality could get you killed. And another example of the radical shift is Alan Pinkerton, who creates a major organization ultimately to serve industry. He was an independent artisan. He created his own company to expose initially thieves. He was central during the Civil War and an aide to Lincoln. So here's Lincoln with Pinkerton in 1862. But Pinkerton was ruthless in destroying strikes at various industries. And this is one, there are numerous strikes, and this is the Carnegie Steel plant that went on strike in 1892. This is it's the home. It's the hold on. It's the Carnegie Steel plant in 1892, which you see the workers. It's a massive plant, and then the Homestead strike in 1892, which was connected to, which is why I included it, the Carnegie Steel plant. And it was a riot. Carnegie, it was in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers versus the Pinkerton agents. The Homestead strike, or the Homestead plant, was a company town that rented homes from Carnegie. Workers demanded more pay and a reduction of their 72-hour work week, which was 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was warfare broke out. Carnegie called in the Pinkertons, an unofficial police force under Alan Pinkerton, who's now, as I said, servicing industry and large corporations. Carnegie called out the Pinkertons, killed several strikers without repercussion, saying that it was in self-defense. Here is another example of the Pullman strike, scenes in and about Chicago. American Railway Union against the Pullman Company. The union struck in response to reduction in wages. Pinkerton's U.S. Marshals and U.S. Army broke up the strike. Strikes were widely seen by, it was almost all men in who had a not working class, but a upper class appointment in corporations. Strikes were seen as analogous to desertion. And in fact, they used that term. They used the term desertion rather than a strike. In 1890s, 1/3 of industrial workers were killed or injured on the job. 1/3. Do you have a hand up? No. Which is, so there were no protections for workers at all. In the 1890s, every third month, there was a major national strike that really achieved virtually little. Today, corporations receive the following constitutional protections, and most of you know this. Free speech, including freedom to influence legislation. Protection from searches. Corporations' belongings are personal. So the corporation's belongings are seen as private, personal material. The Fifth Amendment protections of due process and against double jeopardy and self-incrimination does not exist. No person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall he be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. There was freedom of the press and free speech. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Committee influenced elections through the production and distribution of ads, as I've mentioned before, which has profoundly affected the political situation of the United States. This is a political cartoon of the condition of the laboring man at the Pullman factory. Low wages. It's a torture wheel almost. Low wages at the top, high rent below. Today, corporations receive the following constitutional protections. Most of you know this. Free speech, including freedom to influence legislation. Protection from searches. Corporations' belongings are personal. Fifth Amendment protections of due process and against double jeopardy and incrimination. And this is the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall he be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Also freedom of speech, freedom of press and free speech has been curtailed with the Citizens United versus Federal Election Committee, as I mentioned. Another example of corporations not being able to go to jail is a recent case in 2009 in which Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, pled guilty to multiple criminal felonies. It marketed drugs, notably OxyContin, in ways that may have led to the deaths of numerous people, that led physicians to prescribe and patients to use them in ways that were not intended. There was a $1.2 billion, Pfizer was fined at $1.2 billion, but no one went to jail. No individual was implicated, which also highlights the degree to which, and it still exists, the degree to which a corporation, the best way to define a corporation is it's seen as a citizen, seen as a United States citizen. Question.
That's like the funny part that I can't quite get my head around. Like, how did we get there? Why did this happen?
Yeah, that's a
turnaround.
So I think part of it is how quickly it occurred. You know, it went from literally being within 2 years of the Civil War, the entire North was radically transformed. And part of it was to try to win the war, but part of it was there was also a new young generation of early industrialists who did not fight in the war, but who recognized the path that the evolutionary path that the United States is going, and it needs to become industrialized. And so they were very aggressive at creating if not creating, but developing as quickly as possible industry. And part of it is because the United States, up until the Civil War, felt insecure or inferior to nations like Britain, England, France, most of Europe, because Europeans had industrialized much earlier. And in fact, until the Civil War, in the north, in Boston, in fact, outside of Boston, they sent their, they purchased cotton from Southerners, and they sent that to England to be turned into all kinds of fabric and clothing, because the United States didn't have the industrial operations to do it themselves. And in fact, in the United States, up until the Civil War, I mean, men and women made their own clothes. That's part of the artisanal society or artisanal culture. But the shift was absolutely radical, which I think contributed to the inhumanity of what happened in the Gilded Age. And it was also a period in which, if a number of particularly well-known young men from wealthy families fought in the war, survived, and that became an opportunity for them to become captains of industry or robber barons. And that was very common. And as I mentioned, the early corporations, the organizational structure, they borrowed directly from the military. There is a chain of command, a hierarchy. And there's some nations who still do that. But the United States has done that they did it from the beginning of incorporation. The structure of our corporation is going to be as close as possible to the Union Army. And not the Union Navy, because the Union Navy, you need very qualified sailors to function in water. Whereas in the Army, all you do is give someone a soldier, and you have a general or an officer to tell them what to do. So in that sense, there is a hierarchy, a chain of command in the Army that corporations borrowed from. And many of them were very open about that. They didn't see it as a problem at all. It's a great question. Other questions before I keep going? One of the travesties during this period, by the early 20th century, is the condition of children, working class children. And in fact, in the early 20th century, children often worked 12, 14 hours a day in dangerous occupations. And Louis Hine, I happen to love Louis Hine's photography. He did a series of young boys in factory work in 1909, 10, 11, in that era. And he photographs these boys. So this is a boy in a glass factory who's doing major work, very little training. A lot of young boys in particular lost a hand or a finger or an arm. Here's Pennsylvania breakers mining, and the mining, the germs and the mining was not just backbreaking, but it could lead to emphysema and other diseases because of the material that's there. Here's a young shrimp picker, 5 years old, And his job is essentially an 8 to 10 hour day job of picking shrimp. And a young cigar maker, and the boys make the cigars, and the overseers, or the, I'll call them masters, allowed them to smoke their cigars. The Century magazine in 1894 highlights the sentiment in the North of industrialization. Year after year, Europe pours into the United States multitudes of degenerate human beings who, incited by the freedom of American institutions, immediately give free rein to their atavistic imaginations, meaning protest and strikes against exploitative companies, and plunge into anarchy and lawlessness. These people are savages and should not be treated as civilized beings. When the Indians out west go on the warpath, we know how to control them. And it's a whole separate, at least one separate full class would be the exploitation of indigenous and the indigenous people during and after the Civil War. It was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. When Indians out in the West go on the warpath, we know how to control them. The psychologist considers the anarchist as no better than the Indian, which is essentially celebrating this new. And here's the vanguard of anarchy, which is they're vigorous against activists, against radical activists. The Wobblies, which is the industrial workers of the world, which is the only major movement for workers that had international influence. There were Wobblies throughout Europe and the United States. It was less, but the Wobblies believed that all workers should have equal pay and equal rights and equal hours, regardless of your position. It was a truly egalitarian organization that was just shut down, especially in the wake of World War I. But there was a lot of the clashes between workers and industrialists were from the Wobblies in the early 20th century, and the government was vigorous at suppressing them. This is another example of the celebration or embrace of kind of rampant industrialization. It's from E.L. Godkin, an editor at The Nation, which was considered a progressive paper, a progressive journal, in which Godkin says, all movements to make the government provide for the people are attempts to do away with the need of character. They seek to make the idle and indolent as sure of the future as the industrious and energetic. I do not believe this state of things will ever come about, for it is slavery. For him to characterize it as slavery is fascinating. One of you could write a terrific essay on that. And these were the apostles of social Darwinism. I mean, so in the late 19th century, early 20th century, most well-known figures, there are a few exceptions, they celebrated social Darwinism. And in doing so, they completely distorted Darwin's understanding of Darwinism. Had Darwin still been alive, he would have been shocked and horrified at the way in which industrialists are using his vision, his understanding of social Darwinism. I mean, Darwin himself, he is only focusing on plants and animals. He never suggests his understanding of this kind of warfare or fight for material among humans. He's only focused. I mean, in Darwin himself, he was a scientist who
studied plants and animals. He was the first person to say, I'm not, my career, my occupation is not about human beings, it's about animals and plants. And it's the industrialists who accommodate or incorporate that for their own profits. Even someone like William James, who was generally very much a progressive, it's the idea of Darwinism was so profound that James endorses it. He endorsed the war metaphor in his moral equivalent of war, in which he says, war is the strong life, it is life in extremis. Militarism is the great preserver of our ideals of hardihood, and human life with no use for hardihood would be contemptible. Martial virtues must be the cement of morality. For James, the lesson of the Civil War was that moral certainty was something one should sacrifice a little of in exchange for order and the prevention of bloodshed. And what he's articulating is a sense there is within any organizational structure, there's a hierarchy. And one needs to embrace that hierarchy for in exchange for order and the prevention of bloodshed. Yes.
Should we be surprised though that, like, I guess so that people took, I think, Darwin's belief, Darwin's theory about how species survive
Right.
and apply it to like societies?
Yes.
It just doesn't seem like an crazy.
No, I completely agree with you. I completely agree. I mean, but Darwin himself, he doesn't develop that. I mean, he's much more of his focus is on plants and animals. I mean, he rarely discusses, and when he does, because he's asked a lot about how do your theories manifest itself in terms of people in a nation, in a society, and he did not want to go there. He never saw himself as a politician. He felt very uncomfortable as a politician or as an activist, a social activist. And some of his friends pushed him on that. A number of his friends did. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Does the same go for Lamarck in South America?
Pardon me?
Does the same go for Lamarck and like Lamarckian eugenics?
I'm sorry.
Does the same go for Lamarck?
For who?
Lamarck?
Lamar?
Lamarck. Like so Darwinian eugenics was one
Oh,
guy,
yes.
and Lamarck was the other guy. Does the same
Yes.
go for
No,
humans?
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Other questions? So one of the, just to summarize a bit here, one of the cultural and literary effects of the incorporation of America, and that's a term that a Yale scholar coined or brought into widespread circulation, Alan Trachtenberg. The cultural and literary effects of incorporation of America stark inequalities of wealth and the belief that war is an apt metaphor of life itself. It leads to that vision that was so common among industrialists in the late 19th, early 20th century has a lot of implications. One is, as I think one of you mentioned, is it reflects a displacement of God from the affairs of the world. God is no longer so present or indwelling. So, I mean, go back to, Les Melville, who's fascinating in his own right for many reasons, but Whitman, especially. Whitman called himself a Quaker, and as most of you know, Quakers believe that the inner light of so there is a displacement of God from there's the world versus industrialization, and you see that in terms of the data we have on the number of people and I've looked at it. The statistics from scholars who try to understand the religiosity in the late 19th century is that it's far less than it would be in the 20th century after the transformation of the economy, especially following the legislation in the 1930s, which we'll get to, I think, next week. The cultural and literary effects of incorporation of America, stark inequalities of wealth, and the belief that war is not a metaphor of life itself, also leads to a profound gender shift, and that is the masculinization of society. In the antebellum period, women dominated the literary marketplace. The best-selling books and the best-selling writings in books and newspapers and journals are by women. And in many cases, it's the women who teach their husbands how to write well. Women dominated the literary marketplace. And today, the classics of antebellum literature often are men, but their books did not sell well. They only became fascinating in 20th century because people like Melville and, Whitman is his own separate case, but Whitman's poetry is truly unique. But Whitman himself was, he was as egalitarian as he could be. He at that time, sexuality was not yet defined in terms of homo, hetero, bisexuality. It just didn't. In fact, it was much more fluid and much more common, or much easier for a gay or bisexual person to have relationships. It wasn't. They weren't in prison, and they were for most of the 20th century, from roughly 1900 to 1960 in many states. But they were unusual. They were profoundly unusual. And so the masculinization of society, women no longer control the cultural sphere of the North that they had in the antebellum period. Here's an example of physical culture. There was this focus and emphasis on physicality. It's the period, the gymnasiums were first created in Boston in the 1840s, where men could work out. In fact, Harvard was the first school to have a large gymnasium. That gymnasium is the gas station right on, where is it? Right on when you walk to the Science Center. And the fact the very first gymnasium trainer, was an African American who had been a very successful boxer and very successful and wealthy as a teacher of gymnastics and boxing and the other sports. But that was the first time that organized sports becomes a function. But Harvard is among the first, Harvard, Yale, and Penn were the first schools to create formal athletics. But that was much later than Europe. But physical culture was embraced, which silenced in certain respects women and their role in their cultural role in the nation that continued really to the end of the war. And so here's a woman displacement of God from the affairs of the world, as I mentioned. God was no longer seen as imminent indwelling. Church attendance or its equivalent decline. A radical, profound masculinization of society, which I think was devastating. There was also, as I mentioned, in a sense, a vigorous literary hierarchy. Male writers were now seen as the leading writers, and a lot of brilliant, great women writers were erased or laughed at or demonized. Male writers, the aesthetic or literary form that becomes popular is realism, rather than what was known as romanticism. There's a fusing, but realism is writing a story, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, that accurately represents that society that you're depicting, and been doing so in ways that is also aesthetic, that's beautiful, and in that sense, Europe was in far greater advance than the United States in terms of literature. Literary hierarchy. Male writers are now top writing realism. Women writing sentimentalism now descend, but we now know that a lot of women's writings in the antebellum period and the postbellum period, that sentimentalism is the wrong word. The correct word would be realism. They were realistic in what they wrote. And that religious sentimentalism is popular but no longer in vogue. It led to this rise of realism leads to, first the term is created or emerges in France, and it's a rejection of the visual arts of studio work. And the goal is to experience a direct observation of the material world. And part of this transformation that I highlighted in terms of economics and exploitation, it's just a summary of things that are relatively new. Displacement of God from the affairs of the world, as I already mentioned, masculinization of society, freed the low from the hold of the high, permitting rough-edged, slang-speaking characters, especially as narrators, to be taken seriously. So Mark Twain is a great example. A lot of his, you've read the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's, I think, a masterpiece, but he punches against the what would have long been seen as explodes what had long been seen as formal prose writing. It coincided with the rise of a regimented corporate society in which war was anathema metaphor of life itself, as I mentioned, and that society continued into. That was the model for 20th century society. Yes.
Could you just go back to the comment you made about sexual orientation and how fluid it was?
The sexual orientation?
Yeah, and you were talking about how fluid it was.
Yes.
What period of?
From 1830s, 1820s or 30s until the 1900s. And example, we're in Boston, we're in Cambridge, but a Boston marriage was a euphemism of two women living together for their entire adult lives. They weren't formally married, but they were a couple. And they weren't seen as, evil or wrong, they were treated just like other people were. And there were numerous examples of two men having, and in their private correspondence, both actually in the North and the South, having carnal relations, and it was seen as a sin, but no more of a sin than it would be to get drunk, once in a while. It was much more open. It was much more fluid.
I was just going to say, it's interesting because when you read the Supreme Court cases about leading up to Obergefell, the
Yes,
same-sex
yes.
marriage decision, like the court seems to, you know, through all of human history, you know, it's only been this way,
Yeah,
and
that's just totally
it's
wrong.
totally wrong. Yeah.
Totally wrong. I mean, go back to antiquity in the Bible. There are numerous instances in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament in which two men are sleeping together, two women are sleeping together. I mean, they don't go into detail, but it's what throughout world history it was common, or wasn't uncommon. You know, and what was devastating was the laws that criminalize homosexuality and bisexuality, and they literally criminalized it. If you were a man or woman who was found out to be having intimate relationships with you know, the same gender as yourself, it was a long prison term
And that was like those came into
in the
1960s.
20th century.
Okay.
Yeah, in the 20th century. And even into the 1960s, if you were a man and had a carnal relation, or a woman had a carnal relation, and the penalties were worse on men, it could be a 10-year prison term. I mean, which is just, it's shocking. It really is shocking, especially, you know, where, I mean, not everyone, but, you know, the fact that a comparatively conservative president would sanctify a gay marriage. That's a huge deal, given the history of the 20th century. But it wasn't always that way, as I said. Both in all kinds of ways, in literature, in life. I mean, that's why I use the example of the Boston marriage. I mean, no one blinked an eye at two women living together for 40, 30 years.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like sometimes the way that people think about history, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality, is that we've moved from this place where, you know, we were once so rigid and now we're so fluid. And it's, no, actually we were like, it was, you know, in some ways things were more fluid in the past.
Yes, yes, yes.
And yeah, and it's also interesting to think about like religion. I think people also make this assumption that like the more religious society gets, the more rigid it is.
Yes.
But to your point about the Bible, like early Christian communities,
Yes.
like understandings of sex and gender, which were much more fluid.
Yes, they were. And there are a few denominations, I mean, like Quakers. Quakers from, I mean, both in the 19th century and in the 20th century, that they unlike most other Christian, or many other Christian faiths, the central tenet of Quakerism is that God or Christ is within me or in you and with all humans. And because of that, to do violence or to be critical is to be violent or critical against God. So Quakers were, I mean, there are numerous examples of Quakers, you know, actually even before the 20th century, two men or two women being intimate. It was because God was within them. It was a much more humane, in a sensibility. Yes.
Wasn't Obergefell more about accessing fundamental rights?
Pardon
You know,
me? That what?
Obergefell was more about, I mean, the Boston marriage thing,
Yes.
a lot of that was acknowledged, but there wasn't as much of a push to access the rights and privileges of marriage, right?
That's right.
And that would distinguish it from Obergefell, which
Yes.
is fundamentally about getting the rights of the state to
Yes.
give you certain privileges
Yes.
as members of society. So it's like, obviously it was going on, but it was only permitted so long as they were not trying to get the government to say, you guys are just like us.
Right, but the reason why the recent case needs the government is because in the 19th century there was no government legislation on it. There was in the colonial period. So if in the colonial period and actually even in the Revolution most of the cases were of male farmers having sex with one of their animals. And that led to a long prison term or even death. But that's where some of the early men, they were much more worried about men having sex with animals than they were about men having sex with other men. These are great questions.
Can't lie to Tim.
Professor Stopper,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about unions and masculinity?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Can you talk a little bit about unions and masculinity?
Union and masculinity? Union between two people and
No,
masculinity?
unions, like unions.
Oh, union, labor unions.
Yeah.
That's yeah, so it's a great question. In the early 20th century and the late 19th century, women were part of labor unions. And it wasn't until, I'd have to look back to see the specific, there's a pretty rigid shift in which labor unions are chiefly men. And in essence, women are discriminated. If I remember correctly, it begins in the immediate post-World War II period. And in fact, there's been very successful protests against that over the past 20 years. And there's been, which I think has been very positive in terms of creating unions that are without prejudice. So there's a period in which it's very open, and then especially after World War II, from mid 20th century to the early 21st century, labor unions were almost entirely men. And women were very effective at protesting and finally achieving change. That's a good question. Any other questions? Oh, I can. And that summarizes this period of post-Civil War period in the exploitation. Homer, I will say, Winslow Homer is one of my favorite painters. Homer, many of you are familiar with Winslow Homer. What you probably don't know is that to continue the conversation about gender, best we know is that Homer, he never married, but he was, essentially his partner was an African American, and who was, we don't know how intimate they were, but they were, they lived together. The African American did all of the paperwork for Homer and helped him get, he was instrumental in helping Homer receive more pay for high pay for his images. This is the Gulfstream of 1899, which in a sense captures the kind of the Darwinian world of the post Civil War period. It's an African American who's on a ship. The ship has lost its sails. Sharks are in the foreground. Near the broken boat, the weather is stormy. In the background, in the upper left, you can barely see it if you look at the upper left. There's a four-masted ship, suggesting a dim, hazy source of salvation for the central figure. And the painting, in many respects, reflects a kind of Darwinian world in which Homer lived, who, through his art, tried to chip away at that. But there's a number of different interpretations one could give on this image, but it captures, I think, that the lack of agency in certain respects. Yes.
Yeah, I was trying to remember my comment after the animals, like comment you made, but but going back to the point that was made about like progression and gender and sexuality and how everything is not always like a linear sort of progress, it kind of made me think of the reading that was, I think you're a review of like the reading on Hadleyburg, if I'm saying correctly,
Yes.
and how like this relationship between like collective quote unquote evil and like national identity making.
Yes.
And that one like invocation of Du Bois that was made about like sometimes evil is something that has to be like forgotten or covered over in history, and this like reconstruction being tied into that as well.
Yes.
So I don't know, like it made me think about the way that we think about like history, at least like in this class, and like this revisionist history as a way of like, as opposed to like this Whig history that I'm thinking about like high school and the way that I was taught about things.
Yeah, it's the Whig history is just, I mean, it's totally bankrupt. It's totally, but it's still taught in places. It's still taught in places. And why is that? I think part of it is it reflects the degree to which, I mean, going back to the Reconstruction period and the end of the Civil War, as the Southerners gained control of the story of the war. And it wasn't until literally 1980s that finally major figures started to emphasize the degree to which the war was all about slavery. But from roughly 1870s or 80s to 1990, the story of the war is that slavery was incidental, which is shocking because at the time every Southerner and Northerners recognized it. Southerners were very open about saying we want to defend and expand slavery. It's the greatest institution in world history. That there is a natural hierarchy. Some people are superior to other people, and Southerners pretended that they were happy, they were good parents and overseers to their enslaved people, which is again pure fiction. But that was their justification. One, that slavery had existed throughout history. Two, the enslaved people were better. They were better off on plantations than elsewhere. They vigorously sought to reverse. In fact, I think I mentioned that slavery in the United States, it was the last. Slavery in the U.S. and Brazil were the last two slave societies left on Earth, and so Southerners were the true defendant. They wanted to defend slavery. They were the true conservatives. They wanted to conserve this institution that had existed for most of history. First of all, most of history, yeah, there had been slavery, but in ancient Greece and Rome, the source of slavery was if you were in a war. If you were a prisoner of war, you became a slave. But in every other slave society, if you were a slave, you had a decent chance of becoming free in your lifetime. And that's where the United States is unique. It's unique, is that if you're a Southern slave, your chances of freedom are basically nil. And Britain and in all of history, U.S. is unique in that way. And they wanted to extend that. And they did everything they could. In fact, one of the things Southerners do right after the war is they write the story of the Civil War. They're the first ones to write histories of the Civil War. And they're very aggressive at getting those histories into colleges and universities. And their story is that slavery was a good and benevolent institution, basically. They cast the North as already a voracious, exploitative industrial society, which wasn't the case at all, which we've highlighted. And that continued until 1990, roughly. I think I mentioned that, I came to Harvard in 1998, and I was the first person in the department to teach Frederick Douglass. He had never been taught in the department. Skip Gates taught it in AFAM, but if you were an African American, no matter how brilliant you are as a writer, it wasn't part of the curriculum. That's how bad it was. So there's been a lot of change since then. Yes.
Kind of going back to the reading, one of the things that stood out to me was the kind of satirical and ironical take on Battle Hymn of the Republic.
On the what?
Battle Hymn of the Republic
Yes.
that they had in there. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the rise of irony and how that kind of reflected the mentality of not only like the soldiers, but like as we start to see this like divide between the people who own the corporations and the people that work for them, how
Yes.
that starts to manifest.
That's very good. That's very good. That would be a great essay. That's original. But I've written on the Battle of the Republic, and it's as you know, it's Julie Ward Howe coins it. But during the war, John Brown's Body was the unofficial anthem of the Union Army. Partly because it's much easier to remember as you're marching, whereas the Battle of the Republic, I still can't. I can't. I have to brush up on the Battle Hymn to be able to recite the whole thing.
Yeah.
Whereas, and Julie Ward Howe, she loved John Brown's Body, lies moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. His soul is marching on. She loved that song, but she said that she wrote it because she wanted to elevate the story, the hymn. There's a whole. She says that who knows whether it's true, but after the Battle of the Republic becomes famous, she says that she went to bed. She was in D.C. in the middle of the war, and she woke up, and she was deeply religious, and she said, God gave to me when I woke up. He gave to me the first stanza of this song, and so she rewrote it to elevate it from John Brown's Body.
And then, because the way that I kind of got introduced to the song was it was a school hymn that was sung. Like I'm from Canada, so it had been sung there. So I'm wondering if there's been like proliferation of that kind of song and the way that
And in Canada,
maybe across
that's
in
really
Europe.
interesting. That's a great question. So I will look that up and I'll get back to you. But the short answer is, after the war, I mentioned, I highlighted the degree of imperialism in the wake of the war. A number of otherwise very progressive, if not radical, congressmen wanted to annex Canada. And there was a vigorous movement to try to take Canada, which then was still a colony of England. And that's where that might have occurred. there were a number of, like Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator, I mean, one of the great heroes of, I mean, a staunch abolitionist almost killed on the Senate floor by a Southerner. Charles Sumner, I'd say the one embarrassing aspect of his political life is that he endorsed the annexation of Canada. These are great questions. Any others? Improvements. Yeah. But hopefully, as I mentioned, the shift from artisanal to industrial in the United States was just shockingly fast compared to other countries, other nations. I mean, as I mentioned, because I mean, it was much later in the United States and it coincided. It really begins with the Civil War, which was arguably to this day one of the most transforming events in U.S. history. But the immediate radical shift from artisanship to industrialization is still, to me, just shocking how quickly and inhumane it often was. Yeah.
Do you mind just going back to your point about the sort of displacement of God from affairs of the world?
Yes.
And I'm wondering, like, with this notion in Quakerism of like divine light in each person, does that sort of fade away into a new Christian ideal or way of thinking about persons, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. It led to a profound proliferation of new Protestant organizations.
Okay.
That was probably the most dramatic shift. Is that it wasn't until the late 1900s and especially the early 20th century where Protestant denominations just sprout up. Whereas through the war and before the war, there were Quakers, there were Congregationalists. There weren't that many separate Protestant churches, and there emerged massive number following the war, and which continues today. There in the U.S. and we don't have statistics on the 19th century, but in the 20th and 21st century we do in terms of religiosity in the United States vis-a-vis other developed nations. And the United States, still to this day, is the most religious nation among all developed nations, based on two factors that sociologists use. And one is the number of Americans who say they believe in God or its equivalent without doubting the existence of God or its equivalent. And for most of the 20th, for at least from World War II to recent years, it would be 92 to 97% of all Americans polled saying they believe in God without doubting the existence. And the second question is, how frequently do you attend church as equivalent? And the majority, until around 1990 or so, from 45, when polls became pretty accurate or good, that the majority of Americans attended religious services regularly, meaning once every other religiosity in the United States has declined dramatically. It's now, in terms of the same questions asked, the degree to which one believes in God without doubt in the existence of God is down into the 80 percentile, 85 percentile, 84 percentile, even lower 80s. And the number of Americans who attend church or its equivalent regularly is way down. It's well under 50, it's under 50%. And that's, it's now more similar to all of Europe, basically. And it's partly because in most European countries, the government funds the church. And what virtually every religious scholar has acknowledged is that in the United States, churches need to compete in a marketplace. So they continually revise and adopt or adapt their liturgy and their liturgy, their understanding to accommodate their parishioners. Whereas, and they depend upon essentially money from the parishioners, gifts from parishioners. Whereas the rest of the developed world, the government gives each church money so that they don't need to recruit, so to speak.
I mean, I think the questions that the two questions that you sort of
Right.
spelled out, I mean, I think those are choices, right? And like in terms of how we're even thinking what being religious
Yes,
is,
I
like
completely agree.
I'm like a religious person,
Completely
but
agree.
like I don't go to church very
Yes,
often.
Yes.
I go to the divinity school,
Completely agree.
but yeah, and I mean even like thinking about church, yeah, like church attendance as being a marker, or even like that change, you know, for people to be saying that they are more likely to doubt the
Right.
existence. Like I guess it's like maybe people are more willing to be less certain about truths, and I don't,
Yes.
right? Like so, I think
Completely agree. And
it's
that's a
interesting,
great
those
point
choices.
because I actually I think there's a flaw in the Gallup and other polls that create the polls is they don't acknowledge exactly what you said. You know, they're just looking. I mean, they're trying to do statistics, and that's if you're doing. You can't do statistics when it comes to religion accurately.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to give some blueprint of, you know, how our nation's comparatively religious. And that's the only thing they have if they're going to use that methodology. But you're absolutely right in terms of other methodology would require a lot more money and a lot more people to actually interview people to hear how they actually respond to their understanding.
It sounds like a very Christian-based.
Yes,
Your metric is like going to church every week or
Yes.
going to, you know, some sort of religious
that's
center.
exactly.
Like,
It's almost embarrassingly Christian and especially Protestant.
yeah.
It's very good. And I mean, just as I mentioned that there was, I mean, this was anecdotal among scholars, but there was a pretty considerable decline in religiosity during industrialization. Yes.
If you're trying to understand the cross-cultural, trying to understand how different cultures are or are not religious, do or do not believe in God, what would be the better way of measuring that than asking how confident are you that God exists?
So I think it would require, I think an accurate assessment would be having people actually make a lot of phone calls and trying to speak with citizens of that society and ask them point blank, you know, could you tell me how you feel about your understanding of religion? And polling groups who do that, particularly in politics. You know, in a political election, I get phone calls all the time. You know, can you answer some questions for me? How do you feel about, you know, what's your attitude, your stance on this election coming up? I mean, so the polls, the analysis on religion is, you know, it could borrow from the political pollsters, who are much more, in many respects, accurate, because they actually, I mean, it's a lot of work spending all day just picking up the phone and calling people and trying to get responses, and actually get now you know, a voice on the phone who actually responds. Or on, you know, social media, you can do it
Is
also.
that likely to be less biased?
Pardon me?
Is it likely to be less biased to have like a phone call with somebody and then like assess their religiosity?
Yeah, I think that I mean, Gallup has actually